How can grief be good? So many of us are grieving across the globe right now. Never in the history of humanity has the entire world's population been so united in a collective experience of grief. And it doesn't feel good at all. Everything in us wants to move past this pain. We want to get back to normal and begin to find joy and laughter again. This grief is debilitating and disorienting. But what if there is a way to grieve well? What if our grief can be good? And what if good grief can make all the difference to how we live and face life's challenges? Well, that's what we're exploring today. Hi there, I'm John, the founder and host of evofaith.com and of the Evo Faith Tribe, which is a progressive community for those who no longer find institutional Christianity helpful. If you're looking for a safe and welcoming space where you can ask your questions and speak your truth without fear of judgment or rejection, then we'd love for you to join us. Just go to evofaith.com or evofaithtribe.com to check us out. Or if you want to join, you can sign up there as well. And don't forget to like this video, share it with others, and of course, don't forget to subscribe. In the last couple of weeks on this blog, we've been talking about befriending death, which can sound like I'm saying that we should be totally okay with death and not feel grief or sadness or any of the other difficult emotions that go with death and dying. But that's not what I'm saying at all. Grief is a normal, natural, and necessary response to death. And that's regardless of whether we're talking about the big death of facing the end of our own lives or the loss of a loved one, or the little death of failure, regret, suffering, or loss. It's not that we need to reject grief in order to befriend death. It's that befriending death means learning to grieve well. So what does good grief look like? How do we learn to grieve well? And what difference does it make when we learn to do grief better? I'm so glad you asked. Most of us will have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of dying. And most of us know that those stages can also be applied to grieving, albeit in a different way. Now, it's tempting to think of these stages as a clear linear journey from denial to anger to bargaining to depression to acceptance. But grief is not that easy or simple. Everyone grieves differently. We all grieve for different reasons and in different time frames. And the process of grief is anything but linear. It's probably better not to think in terms of stages of grief, but rather in terms of expressions. And we can move from expression to expression in any order, repeating some or all, sometimes skipping one or two altogether. This is all normal. Good grief is not about following a certain pattern perfectly, as if there is an ideal way to grieve. What makes our grief good or healthy is what happens as we journey through it. For some people, grief becomes a catalyst that removes all restraints on their worst selves. Grief becomes an excuse for treating other people disrespectfully or for ignoring the impact of our moods and actions on those around us. For some, grief becomes a justification for racism, sexism, violence, or selfishness. For others, grief is an excuse to stop trying and to expect the world to be at our beck and call. And when we allow these things to happen, our grief becomes destructive and unhealthy. And that's not good for anyone. I knew a woman once who had lost her son in a war. For decades afterwards, when anyone contradicted her or when people didn't do what she wanted, she would instantly burst into tears and declare, "My son didn't die for this." It was destructive and it was manipulative. And it did lots of damage to her relationships with her family that were still alive. But good grief shifts us to become more compassionate, more gracious, more generous, more creative. Richard Rohr writes that we are transformed into our best, most loving selves by great love or great suffering. And those two things always go together. When we enter into our deaths, big or small, with the acceptance that death is an inseparable part of life, with an openness to the process of grief, and with a willingness to find a deeper life beyond the loss, then grief can be a surprising gift. So how do we grieve well? Here are just a few suggestions off the top of my head that I hope will help. I think the first thing is that we need to accept grief with all its chaos and different elements as normal, as healthy and necessary. I think it's better if we don't try to avoid or fast track the process of grief, but that we enter the grief gently and as willingly as we are able. And then it's really important that we don't try to limit our grief to a linear process or to any specific process. We need to give ourselves permission to go wherever our grief takes us. Express what needs to be expressed when it needs to be expressed. But even as we are processing grief and going through the grief in our own way, it's important to try and maintain a curiosity about our grief, to ask ourselves what we need in each moment, and to try to notice any signs that we may be trying to control or stop or rush our process. I think a sign that we can watch out for is if our hearts start to get hard, then we can take that as a sign that we're not allowing ourselves to process our grief in the most healthy way for us. And then finally, as we grieve with an open heart, and only when we're ready, we can allow our grief to connect us more deeply with the suffering of our world and with the suffering of others. We know that we're moving into a less intense experience of grief when we are able to use our grief to become more compassionate, more loving, more caring, more generous, more supportive of others who are suffering grief too. David Kessler, who worked very closely with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has identified a sixth stage in grieving, which he believes moves us into a deeper healing, a richer life beyond the grief, or even in the grief, because let's face it, some griefs never go away. And this sixth stage is the stage of meaning. It is this ability to make or to find meaning in our grief that empowers us to move more easily into a place of peace, and that makes us more able to return to joy and aliveness. Have you experienced good grief? What was that like for you? What made it good? How did your experience of good grief help you to befriend death a little more? I hope that we can all use the grief of this pandemic to lead us into deeper connection with each other, into a deeper compassion for the suffering, and into a deeper sense of meaning and richness in our one wild and precious life, to borrow a phrase from poet Mary Oliver. Thank you for watching. Please like this video if you found it meaningful. Share it with everyone who needs to hear it. And subscribe so you don't miss future videos. See you next time.